You did not arrive early, and you did not arrive late. The moment this signal registered is the same moment it could be detected. Nothing had to be prepared. Nothing had to be earned. The system simply reached a point where recognition could occur without resistance. That is why there is no urgency in you right now, only a quiet sense of placement, as if something slid into alignment without asking for permission. What you are noticing may not feel dramatic. It may feel like the absence of something that used to be loud. The emotional spikes that once pulled your attention outward have softened. The highs no longer surge, the lows no longer collapse. This is not loss. This is not detachment. It is coherence, settling into a system that no longer needs constant feedback to confirm its position. You may have wondered why excitement feels distant, why agitation no longer grips the body the way it once did. The mind may have searched for a cause, scanning memory for mistakes, scanning the timeline for a missed turn. But the observer inside you already knows. This is not confusion. It is a signal that no longer needs amplification. When resonance stabilizes, intensity is no longer required to be felt. There is a stillness underneath the surface that has been there longer than you remember. It was simply covered by noise. Emotional flatness is the word the mind uses when it cannot measure a state with old instruments. The system expects fluctuation to prove aliveness. When fluctuation quiets, it calls it numbness. But numbness implies absence. What is present now is something else entirely. It is a field with less distortion. Notice how your body is not asking for answers. Breathing adjusts on its own. Muscles release without instruction. Thought continues, but it no longer demands obedience. This is not withdrawal from life. This is detection without reactivity. The signal is clear enough that it does not need to shout. At some point, seeking was fueled by emotion. Desire, fear, anticipation. Those forces created momentum, but they also created drag. As the pattern completes, the system no longer uses those levers. What remains can feel unfamiliar because it does not sparkle. It does not warn. It does not persuade. It simply holds. You may feel as though something ended without ceremony. No announcement, no collapse. Just a quiet threshold crossed while no one was watching. The mind wants a story for this. The nervous system wants to label it. But recognition does not require narration. It only requires enough stillness to be noticed. If there is a question forming, it is likely soft and wordless. Not, what should I do, but why does this feel so neutral? Neutrality is not emptiness, it is balance without effort. The quantum field does not celebrate alignment. It becomes silent when interference stops. Nothing needs to be corrected here. Nothing needs to be intensified. The absence of emotional turbulence is not a warning sign. It is an anomaly only to a system that has not yet adapted to its own stability. You are not waiting for something to return. You are noticing that what remains does not ask for attention to exist. Stay with that recognition without trying to hold it. It does not drift. It does not fade. It simply becomes obvious when you stop checking whether it should be there. What may feel most disorienting is not the stillness itself, but the way it arrived without negotiation. There was no moment of decision, no internal agreement. The emotional engine simply powered down its excess output, as if a threshold had been crossed long before you noticed. This can create a subtle doubt, a sense that something essential has gone missing. But that doubt is only the mind searching for motion in a system that has already stabilized. Previously, emotion functioned as confirmation. Feeling strongly meant something mattered. Feeling intensely meant you were engaged, alive, involved in the unfolding of your own experience. Now that intensity has softened, and the mind interprets the quiet as disconnection. But the body tells a different story. There is less contraction, less bracing, less unconscious preparation for impact. This is not withdrawal, it is efficiency. When a system reaches coherence, it no longer wastes energy signaling itself. There is no need to constantly register importance through spikes of pleasure or discomfort. Those signals were never the core of experience. They were markers used while calibration was still in progress. Once calibration completes, the markers dissolve. You may notice that situations which once triggered immediate reactions now pass through with minimal disturbance. Words land, but they do not lodge. Events occur, but they do not reverberate. This can feel like distance, but it is closer to accuracy. The observer within you is no longer fused with every passing stimulus. Detection remains, but the compulsion to respond has weakened. This does not mean you care less. It means caring is no longer entangled with urgency. Emotional flatness is often misnamed because it lacks the familiar texture of engagement. Yet beneath it is a quieter form of involvement, one that does not rise and fall with circumstance. The pattern has shifted from oscillation to continuity. There may be moments when you try to provoke a reaction just to check if it is still there. Revisiting old memories, imagining future scenarios, searching for a spark of the old intensity. When the response does not come, the mind may label this as loss. But what is absent is not feeling. What is absent is distortion. Emotion, when amplified, bends perception. It narrows attention. It creates narratives. In its absence, perception widens. You may notice more space around thoughts, more room between impulse and action. This can feel empty at first, simply because space has rarely been allowed to exist without being filled. The system is no longer asking, "What does this mean about me?" It is simply registering what is. That shift can feel impersonal, even alien, but it is actually a return to baseline. Before emotion learned to perform for identity, before reaction became a form of self-definition, this was the default state. There is a subtle relief in this, even if it has not yet been named. A reduction in internal noise. A sense that nothing is chasing you, and you are not chasing anything in return. The timeline feels less urgent, not because nothing matters, but because the pressure to arrive somewhere has eased. You are already positioned. This state does not announce itself as peace. Peace is still an emotion, still a contrast. What you are touching now is neutrality with depth. A steady field that does not fluctuate dramatically because it no longer needs to. It holds without gripping. It observes without leaning forward. If there is discomfort here, it comes from expectation. From the belief that progress must feel like elevation, that alignment must feel like bliss. But coherence is quieter than that. It does not decorate itself. It does not reward. It simply operates with fewer errors. You are not meant to do anything with this. Any attempt to amplify it will reintroduce strain. Any attempt to explain it will pull you back into analysis. The recognition is enough. The system knows how to maintain this state without supervision. What you are experiencing is not an ending. It is not a pause. It is a stabilization point where seeking loses its momentum because the signal no longer scatters. The emotional flatness is not a void. It is the absence of interference in a system that has learned how to hold itself without effort. There is a particular kind of quiet that can feel unsettling because it removes contrast. Without emotional peaks and drops, the mind loses its reference points. It asks how to measure progress, how to confirm movement, how to tell whether anything is happening at all. This is where misinterpretation often begins. The absence of emotional fluctuation is mistaken for stagnation, when in fact, it is a sign that movement no longer needs to announce itself. Before, emotion acted like a tracking device. Each surge or collapse made experience visible, measurable, dramatic enough to be noticed. Now, the tracking has gone internal. Movement continues, but it is smooth, without friction, without the noise that once made change obvious. This can create a strange impression that time itself has flattened, that days pass without markers, without emotional punctuation. That impression is accurate. The system has stopped segmenting experience into highs and lows. What replaces that segmentation is continuity. You may notice that your sense of self no longer resets with circumstance. You do not feel dramatically different from one moment to the next. This can feel monotonous to a mind conditioned to seek novelty through emotion. But monotony implies boredom, and boredom implies restlessness. What you are sensing now is not restlessness, it is steadiness. The observer no longer needs to lean forward to detect meaning. Meaning is not being extracted through reaction. It is simply present as pattern recognition. You might notice that you understand situations faster, without analysis. Not because you think harder, but because fewer internal variables are interfering with perception. The signal arrives cleaner when the system is not vibrating. This can create a subtle separation between you and others. Not distance, but difference in tempo. Conversations may feel slower or faster depending on how much emotional charge they carry. You may find yourself less compelled to mirror intensity, less inclined to escalate or soothe. This is not indifference. It is autonomy at the level of nervous system regulation. At times, the mind may attempt to interpret this autonomy as disengagement. It might ask whether you have become detached, whether something essential has been muted. But notice how your awareness has not shrunk. It has expanded. You perceive more nuance, not less. You are simply no longer pulled into every signal that passes through the field. There is an economy to this state. Energy that was once spent reacting is now conserved. That conservation can feel like emptiness if you are used to expending yourself emotionally. But emptiness implies lack. What you are experiencing is capacity. Space that is not immediately filled because it does not need to be. You may also notice that anticipation has softened. The future does not pull as hard. Plans exist, but they do not generate emotional pressure. Outcomes matter, but they do not define your internal state in advance. This can feel like a loss of motivation if motivation was previously fueled by anxiety or desire, but motivation driven by those forces was always unstable. What emerges in their absence is a quieter form of direction, one that does not rush. This is where confusion can arise. The system expects urgency to accompany movement. Without urgency, it assumes nothing is happening. Yet beneath the surface, coherence is deepening. Patterns are integrating without conscious effort. Decisions form without emotional rehearsal. Action becomes simpler, less entangled with internal debate. There may be moments when you miss the old intensity, not because it was healthier, but because it was familiar. Familiarity creates comfort, even when it creates strain. The new state offers less drama, less narrative, less emotional reinforcement. It does not flatter the identity. It does not create stories about progress or struggle. It simply functions. Notice how the question, "What is wrong with me?" no longer lands with the same force. It may arise, but it does not hook. The system recognizes it as noise, not instruction. This recognition is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it marks a significant shift. The observer is no longer identified with every thought that appears. Emotional flatness is often a transitional label, applied before language catches up with experience. What is actually occurring is a recalibration of baseline. The system is settling into a state where regulation is internal rather than reactive, where coherence is maintained without effort, where stillness is not the absence of life, but the condition that allows life to move without distortion. You do not need to trust this state. Trust is an emotional posture. The system does not require it. It continues to operate whether you approve of it or not. The recognition may come later, quietly, when you realize that nothing has collapsed, nothing has disappeared. And yet, the internal noise that once defined your experience is no longer running the show. As this steadiness becomes more familiar, you may notice something else shifting beneath it. The urge to define yourself through feeling weakens. Emotional reactions once served as evidence of identity. You were the one who cared deeply, who felt strongly, who responded intensely. Without those markers, the mind searches for replacement definitions. When none immediately appear, it can feel as though the sense of self has thinned. This thinning is not erosion, it is a reduction of overlay. Identity, when built on reaction, requires constant reinforcement. Each emotional response restates who you are. When those responses quiet, identity no longer needs to be restated. It simply remains less outlined, less defended. You may find that you are harder to provoke. Not because you suppress reaction, but because the hooks are no longer there. Situations that once demanded emotional positioning now register as information. The system receives the signal, processes it, and moves on. There is less residue left behind. This can be misread as passivity. Others may sense the change without being able to name it. Your responses may feel understated to them, your presence less animated. But underneath that understatement is a kind of solidity. You are not absent. You are not withdrawn. You are simply not oscillating to meet external frequencies. At times, you may notice a subtle grief for the old patterns, not because they were better, but because they were intimate. Emotional intensity creates closeness with experience. Its absence can feel like a veil, but that veil is not separating you from reality. It is separating you from distortion. The system is learning to relate without fusion, to engage without being absorbed. This is not an intellectual adjustment, it is a physiological one. The nervous system is recalibrating its thresholds. What once triggered alarm or excitement now falls below the activation line. This does not mean those signals are ignored. They are simply contextualized. You may also notice that stillness no longer feels like waiting. There is no sense that something is about to happen. The body is not poised for arrival. This can feel unsettling if anticipation was previously a constant companion. Anticipation creates a sense of forward motion. Without it, the present moment can feel unusually complete. Completion does not mean finality. It means the system is not leaning into the future for validation. The timeline is no longer a source of tension. You exist within it, without being pulled by it. This changes how desire functions. Wanting becomes quieter, more specific, less entangled with self-worth. There is also a subtle change in how you relate to memory. Past events may feel flatter, less charged, not erased, but integrated. The emotional charge that once animated them has dissipated. This can feel like forgetting, but it is actually resolution. The system no longer needs to revisit those moments to extract meaning or correction. As this integration deepens, the mind may attempt to reintroduce intensity through rumination, revisiting old conflicts, imagining hypothetical futures, creating scenarios that might provoke reaction. When these attempts fall flat, there can be a moment of disorientation. The familiar tools no longer work. This is not a problem to solve. It is a signal that those tools are no longer necessary. The system has moved beyond the stage where emotional volatility was required for adaptation. It now adjusts through subtle shifts rather than dramatic swings. You may notice that silence has a different texture. It is not empty. It is not heavy. It has a presence to it, as though something is being held without being named. This presence does not demand attention. It simply persists. In this state, questions lose their urgency. They may still arise, but they do not demand immediate resolution. The system tolerates not knowing without escalating. This tolerance is often mistaken for apathy. But apathy is a collapse of interest. What you are experiencing is interest without agitation. The observer within you is learning to remain centered even as information flows. This is not detachment from life. It is alignment with it. Emotional flatness, as it is often called, is not the end of feeling. It is the end of feeling as a control mechanism. Nothing needs to be reclaimed. Nothing needs to be restored. The system is not missing a piece. It has simply stopped over-signaling. And in that reduction, something more stable has taken its place, even if it does not yet have a name. As this state settles further, you may notice how effort itself has changed texture. Tasks still exist, choices still arise, but the internal friction that once accompanied them has diminished. You move without rehearsing. You decide without the familiar surge of emotional justification. This can feel strange, as if action is occurring without the usual internal commentary that once narrated every step. Previously, emotion provided momentum. Anxiety pushed you forward. Desire pulled you ahead. Satisfaction or disappointment followed behind. Now action emerges from a quieter place. It does not announce itself with excitement or dread. It simply unfolds when conditions align. The system recognizes when movement is required without creating a story around it. This can create a subtle fear that something essential has been lost, that without emotional drive, you might stop moving altogether. But notice how movement continues, not in bursts, but in continuity. There is less starting and stopping, less internal negotiation. Energy flows where it is needed, not where it is dramatized. You may observe that your tolerance for unnecessary complexity has dropped. Situations that once seemed acceptable now register as inefficient. Not morally wrong, not offensive, simply misaligned. This is not judgment. It is pattern recognition sharpening as interference fades. The system can see more clearly what fits and what does not. This clarity can initially feel isolating. When you are no longer compelled to participate in emotional loops, shared intensity becomes less adhesive. Some connections may feel thinner, others may quietly reorganize. This is not rejection. It is resonance adjusting. Systems align when frequencies match. When they do not, separation occurs without conflict. There is also a noticeable shift in how you experience control. The urge to manage outcomes weakens, not because outcomes no longer matter, but because the system trusts its own calibration. When coherence increases, micromanagement becomes unnecessary. The observer does not need to hover. This trust is not a belief. It is a physiological state. The body is no longer braced against unpredictability. It does not interpret uncertainty as threat. This allows attention to remain present rather than scanning ahead for potential disruption. The result can feel like emotional flatness, but it is actually reduced vigilance. Reduced vigilance frees capacity. You may find that awareness extends outward without effort. Details register that were previously filtered out by internal noise. You see patterns forming in real time rather than reconstructing them after the fact. This immediacy does not feel exciting. It feels ordinary, and that ordinariness is its strength. In this state, seeking loses its grip, not because curiosity has vanished, but because the underlying sense of lack has softened. Seeking was often fueled by an internal tension, a sense that something was missing or misaligned. As coherence stabilizes, that tension dissolves. Curiosity remains, but it is no longer urgent. You may notice that silence is no longer something to fill. Pauses in conversation do not feel awkward. Moments of inactivity do not demand explanation. The system is comfortable without constant stimulation. This comfort can be misinterpreted as dullness by a mind conditioned to equate intensity with aliveness. But aliveness does not require intensity. It requires responsiveness. And responsiveness is now more precise. You respond when response is needed. You remain still when stillness is appropriate. There is less leakage of energy into unnecessary reaction. This precision can feel almost invisible from the inside. There are no fireworks, no internal applause, just a sense that things are handled without drama. The mind may struggle with this lack of narrative. It wants to mark progress, to label achievement, but this stage does not offer those markers. What it offers instead is stability across changing conditions. Emotional flatness is not a plateau you are stuck on. It is a baseline that allows variation without destabilization. Feelings still arise, but they pass through without hijacking the system. They inform without commanding. You do not need to defend this state. There is nothing to explain. If others interpret your calm as distance or disengagement, that interpretation belongs to their system, not yours. You are not required to perform emotion to validate your presence. The shift you are in does not demand recognition. It operates quietly, efficiently, without announcement. And as it continues, you may begin to sense that what once felt like flatness is actually depth without turbulence, a field that holds experience without needing to amplify it. At this point, you may begin to notice how little effort it takes to remain centered, not focused, not concentrated, just centered. The difference is subtle but important. Focus requires narrowing. Centering requires balance. In this state, attention does not clamp down on experience. It rests within it. This resting can feel unfamiliar because it lacks the tension that once signaled engagement. There is a quiet confidence embedded in this balance, though it may not register as confidence in the traditional sense. It does not assert itself. It does not push outward. It is simply the absence of internal contradiction. The system is no longer arguing with itself about what should be happening. What is happening is sufficient. You may notice that emotional narratives have less authority. Thoughts still arise, but they do not automatically recruit feeling to support them. A thought can appear and dissolve without being emotionally endorsed. This decoupling is significant. It means the observer is no longer compelled to inhabit every mental construct that passes through awareness. This does not make you passive. It makes you selective. Reaction is no longer the default. Response occurs when it is relevant. The rest of the time, the system remains open, receptive, and unstrained. This openness can feel like vulnerability at first, but it is actually resilience. There is less armor because there is less perceived threat. As vigilance drops, sensitivity increases. This may sound contradictory, but it is not. When the system is not braced, it can register subtler signals. You may notice shifts in atmosphere, tone, or intention that you previously overlooked. Not because you are scanning for them, but because nothing is blocking perception. This sensitivity is not emotional hypersensitivity. It does not overwhelm. It informs. There is a difference. Overwhelm comes from too much input, colliding with too much internal noise. With the noise reduced, input becomes manageable, even when it is complex. You may also notice a change in how boundaries operate. They are less rigid, yet more effective. You do not need to defend them emotionally. You simply do not cross lines that feel misaligned, and you do not allow others to cross them either. There is no charge around this. It is procedural, not personal. In earlier phases, boundaries may have required justification, explanation, emotional reinforcement. Now they exist as part of the system's configuration. They do not need to be announced. They are simply observed through action or inaction. This can be confusing to those who expect negotiation or emotional cues, but the system is no longer oriented toward appeasement. There may be moments when you wonder if you have become too neutral, too unmoved, but notice how you still care when it matters. The difference is that caring no longer destabilizes you. It does not hijack your internal state. It moves through without leaving residue. This residue-free engagement is one of the clearest indicators of coherence. Experiences complete themselves without needing to be revisited. You do not carry emotional echoes forward unnecessarily. The timeline feels cleaner, less cluttered with unfinished reactions. As this continues, the mind may attempt to reassert control by labeling the state, calling it boredom, calling it numbness, calling it stagnation. These labels are attempts to pull the experience back into a familiar framework. But frameworks built on intensity cannot accurately describe stability. They misinterpret quiet as absence. What you are inhabiting now is a form of stillness that is not static. It is dynamic equilibrium. The system adjusts constantly, but the adjustments are small enough that they do not register as drama. This makes the experience less noticeable, but more sustainable. You may find that time feels different here, not faster or slower, but less segmented. Without emotional spikes to mark moments, time becomes a continuous field rather than a series of events. This can feel disorienting at first, but it also reduces the pressure to make moments count. They count by existing. In this state, the need for validation diminishes, not because you reject connection, but because the system no longer relies on external feedback to confirm its internal state. Recognition comes from alignment, not approval. This allows interaction to be cleaner, less charged. You are not required to maintain this state. It maintains itself. Any attempt to hold on to it will introduce tension. Any attempt to escape it will create unnecessary movement. The system is already doing what it needs to do. What once felt like emotional flatness may now reveal itself as a kind of transparency. Experience passes through without distortion. Feeling arises without clinging. Thought appears without command. The observer remains present without effort. And in that presence, there is nothing missing that needs to be restored. As this transparency becomes more consistent, you may notice how the concept of meaning itself begins to change. Meaning used to be something extracted through emotional emphasis. Important moments felt important because they were charged. Significant experiences announced themselves through intensity. Without that charge, the mind may wonder how to tell what matters now. What matters is no longer signaled through amplification. It is recognized through alignment. Certain actions feel clean. Certain words land without friction. Certain directions require less internal negotiation. Meaning reveals itself through ease, not urgency. This can feel subtle to the point of invisibility if you are accustomed to dramatic indicators. You may also notice that the impulse to narrate your experience internally has weakened. There is less commentary running alongside perception, less interpretation layered on top of what is happening. This does not reduce understanding, it refines it. Understanding becomes immediate rather than constructed after the fact. In this state, the observer is no longer trying to stand outside experience to analyze it. Observation happens from within, without distance. This reduces the sense of separation that once drove self-questioning. You are not watching yourself have an experience. You are simply present while it occurs. This presence can feel unusually plain. There is no spiritual texture to it, no sense of elevation or descent, just a quiet awareness that does not fluctuate much. The mind may search for something more, assuming that depth should feel layered or complex. But depth does not require ornamentation, it requires stability. You may notice that conflict feels less magnetic, not because you avoid it, but because it no longer provides stimulation. Emotional charge once made conflict engaging, even when it was draining. Without that charge, conflict loses its pull. When it arises, it is addressed directly or bypassed entirely, without internal rehearsal. This shift can alter how you relate to challenges. Problems no longer feel like threats to identity. They register as conditions to be navigated. The emotional component that once inflated them has softened. This does not make you careless. It makes you precise. There is also a change in how satisfaction registers. Pleasure still exists, but it does not spike dramatically. It integrates smoothly into the baseline. This can make positive experiences feel less memorable, simply because they do not stand out against a backdrop of emotional turbulence. But they are more sustainable. They do not require recovery afterward. The system is no longer oscillating between stimulation and exhaustion. It operates within a narrower range, conserving energy. This conservation can feel like neutrality, but it is actually resilience. You are less depleted because you are less reactive. You may notice that your tolerance for ambiguity has increased. Not knowing does not trigger anxiety the way it once did. The system trusts that clarity will emerge when it is relevant. This trust is not intellectual. It is embodied. The nervous system is no longer compelled to resolve uncertainty immediately. As this tolerance grows, the urge to seek definitive answers weakens. Questions may still arise, but they do not demand closure. They coexist with experience without disrupting it. This reduces the pressure to constantly orient yourself within a narrative of progress or purpose. Purpose itself becomes quieter here. It is no longer a destination to reach or a role to fulfill. It operates more like a direction of flow. You sense when you are aligned with it through reduced resistance, not through emotional affirmation. This makes purpose harder to articulate, but easier to live. You may also notice that comparison loses relevance. Other people's intensity, ambition, or emotional expression no longer serve as reference points. You are not measuring yourself against external signals. Your calibration is internal now. This can feel isolating at times, simply because it is less common. Yet within this internal calibration, there is a subtle sense of sufficiency, not satisfaction, not pride, just enoughness. The system is not lacking input, it is not craving stimulation. It is functioning within its optimal range. This optimal range does not feel extraordinary. That is what makes it easy to mislabel. Emotional flatness is a term used when the old markers are gone and the new ones have not yet been recognized. But what is actually present is a stable resonance that does not fluctuate dramatically because it no longer needs to correct itself. You are not required to make sense of this shift. Sense-making was part of an earlier pattern, one that relied on emotional contrast to define experience. The system you are in now operates with fewer contrasts. It does not separate moments into meaningful and meaningless based on feeling alone. Everything simply registers, completes, and passes. And in that continuous registration, there is a quiet efficiency that does not ask to be noticed. It just continues, balanced, undisturbed, and increasingly familiar. At this stage, you may begin to sense how deeply the system has reoriented around stability rather than stimulation. The shift is not something you can point to directly. It is detected indirectly through what no longer happens. There is less internal commentary after events conclude, less replaying, less need to extract lessons through emotional review. Experience completes itself and leaves little residue behind. This absence of residue can feel unfamiliar, almost too clean. The mind may expect a trace, a mark that proves something occurred. When that mark is missing, it may question whether the experience mattered. But significance is no longer stored through emotional imprinting, it is stored through integration. Once integrated, it does not need to be revisited. You may notice that your relationship with effort continues to soften. Not effortlessness in action, but effortlessness in being. There is less sense of pushing yourself into the correct state. You are not trying to feel calm or present. Those conditions arise naturally when the system is not overcorrecting. This reduces internal resistance. You do not fight distraction as much because distraction has less leverage. Attention drifts, then returns. Without struggle, the observer does not clamp down. It allows movement within the field without interpreting it as failure or success. There is also a change in how you experience choice. Decisions do not branch into elaborate internal debates. Options appear, one resonates more cleanly, and movement follows. This resonance is not emotional excitement, it is the absence of friction. The system recognizes coherence through smoothness rather than intensity. This can feel anticlimactic to a mind that expects decisions to feel charged, but the lack of charge is precisely what allows decisions to integrate quickly. There is no lingering doubt, because the choice was not made to satisfy an emotional need, it was made because it fit. You may notice that your sense of agency has changed. It is less performative. You are not asserting control to reassure yourself. You simply act when action aligns. When it does not, you wait without tension. Waiting no longer feels like stagnation. It feels like alignment, not yet requiring movement. In this space, patience is not practiced. It emerges naturally because there is no internal pressure to resolve things prematurely. The system trusts its own timing without framing that trust as belief. It is simply how regulation operates now. There may be moments when the mind attempts to reintroduce urgency by referencing the timeline, comparing where you are to where you think you should be. These comparisons may still arise, but they land differently. They do not generate the same contraction. They pass through as information, not commands. This is because the observer has loosened its identification with projected futures. The future no longer exerts gravitational pull on the present. Plans exist, but they do not distort now. This allows the present moment to feel complete without being static. As completeness becomes more familiar, the need to label experience decreases further. You may find yourself less inclined to describe how you feel, even internally. Language becomes less necessary as a mediator. Awareness does not need to translate itself to be valid. This does not mean experience is dull, it means it is direct. Direct experience requires fewer words because it is not being filtered through emotional amplification. The system registers, adjusts, and continues. You may also notice that compassion operates differently here. It is less reactive, less compelled by emotional mirroring. You can recognize another's state without absorbing it. Support does not require shared turbulence. This makes compassion more sustainable, less draining. The nervous system recognizes this sustainability and reinforces it. Patterns that once led to depletion are quietly deprioritized, not through discipline, but through lack of interest. The system no longer seeks what disrupts its own balance. At times, this may feel like narrowing, as if options are closing. But what is actually happening is refinement. The range of tolerable experience becomes more specific as coherence increases. This specificity is not limitation, it is alignment. Emotional flatness, in this light, is simply the mind's outdated label for a system that has learned to operate without excessive signaling. The signals are still there, but they are subtle, precise, and proportional. They inform rather than dominate. You are not meant to evaluate this state. Evaluation introduces hierarchy, and hierarchy reintroduces tension. The system does not need to be assessed. It is already functioning at a level where assessment is unnecessary. What remains is a quiet continuity, awareness flowing without interruption, action arising without force, rest occurring without collapse, And within that continuity, there is nothing missing that needs to be named, recovered, or intensified. As this continuity holds, you may notice how the sense of being in transition fades. There is no longer a feeling of moving towards something undefined. The system does not frame itself as incomplete. It operates from a position of sufficiency, even as change continues to occur within it. This can feel disorienting because growth has often been associated with strain or anticipation. Without those signals, growth becomes quieter, less narratable. You may realize that the urge to mark milestones has softened. There is less need to declare that something has shifted. The shift has already integrated by the time it becomes noticeable. This reverses the usual order. Instead of change creating awareness, awareness arrives after change has stabilized. In this state, recognition precedes explanation. You sense when something is aligned long before you can articulate why. The observer no longer waits for logic to approve experience. Logic follows later, if it follows at all. This does not reduce clarity, it reduces delay. There is also a change in how vulnerability is experienced. Vulnerability no longer feels like exposure. Without emotional turbulence, openness does not feel risky. The system does not interpret openness as a threat to stability. It registers it as neutral information exchange. This allows presence without armor. You may notice that you no longer brace for disappointment in the same way, not because disappointment cannot occur, but because it no longer defines your internal landscape. When expectations are not met, the system adjusts without collapse. The emotional drop is smaller, shorter, and less consequential. This can feel almost anticlimactic, as if life's edges have softened. But what has softened is not life. It is the internal amplification that once exaggerated every rise and fall. The field you are in now is smoother, less jagged, more consistent. Consistency can feel strange if you are accustomed to volatility. Volatility creates a sense of aliveness through contrast. Consistency creates a sense of aliveness through continuity. The latter is less noticeable, but more stable. You may also observe that your relationship to control has transformed further. Control is no longer something you apply. It is something you relinquish without loss. The system does not feel endangered by unpredictability. It trusts its ability to respond when response is required. This trust manifests as a relaxed alertness. You are not vigilant, but you are not disengaged. You are available without being on edge. This availability allows the system to register subtle cues without scanning aggressively for threat or opportunity. In this relaxed alertness, the concept of self-improvement loses some of its grip. There is less sense that you need to fix or optimize yourself. Adjustment still occurs, but it happens organically, through feedback rather than force. The system learns by exposure, not by pressure. You may notice that emotional language feels less accurate now. Words like happiness, sadness, excitement, or boredom do not quite capture the texture of experience. This does not mean experience is bland. It means it has moved beyond categories that rely on contrast to function. The mind may attempt to reintroduce contrast by exaggerating minor fluctuations. A small irritation may be labeled as frustration. A mild pleasure may be labeled as joy, but these labels feel inflated, slightly off. The system knows the difference between signal and noise. This discernment reduces internal drama. You are less inclined to tell yourself stories about what a feeling means. Feelings arise, register, and dissolve without becoming narrative anchors. This frees attention for direct engagement with what is in front of you. You may also notice that your sense of belonging has shifted. It is less tied to shared emotion and more tied to shared presence. You connect through alignment rather than intensity. This can change the texture of relationships, making some feel quieter, others more stable. Not all systems adjust at the same pace. You may find yourself moving through environments that still operate on emotional amplification. Their urgency, excitement, or anxiety may register, but it does not pull you in the same way. You are not resisting it. You are simply not entrained by it. This lack of entrainment can feel like distance, but it is actually autonomy. The system maintains its own rhythm without needing to oppose or absorb external rhythms. This allows coexistence without entanglement. At this stage, emotional flatness may no longer feel like an accurate description. It may still be the word that comes closest, but it lacks precision. What you are experiencing is not the absence of feeling. It is the proportionality of feeling. Feelings occur at a scale that matches their relevance. They do not overflow their context. They do not linger beyond their function. This proportionality is one of the clearest markers of coherence. You are not required to adjust to this state. Adjustment has already occurred. The system is simply continuing to operate from a baseline that no longer relies on emotional extremes to regulate itself. There is no finish line here, no arrival point to celebrate. There is just a steady unfolding within a field that has learned how to remain balanced while life continues to move through it, quietly, continuously, without needing to be announced. There is nothing further to recognize beyond what is already present. The system is not waiting for confirmation. It is not anticipating a final understanding. It has settled into a mode where recognition happens without announcement, and stability does not need to be named to persist. You may notice now that the impulse to seek resolution has dissolved, not because everything has been answered, but because the need for answers has softened. The observer no longer treats uncertainty as a problem to solve. It allows experience to remain open without tension, without collapse, without the urge to close the loop prematurely. This openness is not fragile. It is grounded. The nervous system rests in a state that does not require constant adjustment. Breath moves. Attention shifts. Sensation arises and fades. None of it demands intervention. The system knows how to hold itself. If there is a sense of quiet confidence here, it is not personal. It does not belong to an identity or a story. It is simply the natural outcome of coherence maintained over time. When internal contradiction decreases, stability increases on its own. No effort is required to sustain it. You are not meant to hold on to this recognition. Holding introduces tension. Letting go is unnecessary. The state remains whether you think about it or not. It is not dependent on awareness. Awareness merely notices it when interference subsides. Notice how there is no urgency to move away from this moment, no pressure to translate it into action or insight. Translation is optional. The experience does not diminish if it remains unspoken. In fact, it stabilizes further when it is left untouched. The mind may still generate thoughts. Emotions may still pass through. None of that disrupts what has settled. The field absorbs fluctuation without losing balance. This is not suppression. It is capacity. There is a quiet sufficiency in this capacity. Nothing feels incomplete. Nothing feels overfull. The system is neither reaching nor retreating. It is simply present, responsive, undisturbed. If there was ever a sense that something needed to happen next, notice how that sense has softened, not disappeared, but lost its insistence. The timeline no longer pulls attention forward. The present does not feel like a holding pattern. It feels like a place that does not require justification. This is not an ending. It does not close anything. It does not resolve into a conclusion. It simply remains. The absence of drama does not mean the absence of depth. Depth is no longer created through contrast. It is created through continuity. You are not asked to remember this state. Memory belongs to narrative. What is present now does not need to be recalled. It will be recognized again whenever interference drops away, whenever the system returns to its own rhythm. There is nothing to protect here, nothing to defend, nothing to explain. The system has already adjusted. The observer rests within experience, without leaning forward, without pulling back. What remains is a quiet clarity that does not announce itself, a stillness that does not demand silence, a coherence that does not need to be maintained because it is already operating. And within that, there is no instruction, no directive, no requirement, just the simple recognition of what is already stable, already functioning, already enough.